I'm Izza, aka EvilCleverDog, and today I'm going to show you how I made the Stygian Blade from Hades. Like pretty much everyone I know, I've been absolutely obsessed with Supergiant Games HADES recently, so of course I had to make something from it, and what better to start with than the sword wielded by Zagreus himself. But the skills I'm going to be showing you in this video are completely transferable, so you could watch this tutorial and make your own Stygian Blade just like my one, or you could use the skills I showcase here to make any other kind of prop sword of your choice. So join me as I take you through my full process of building a prop sword, from pattern to painting. First, I find as many reference images of the sword as I can. There are some minor differences in how the blade is drawn in different artworks and so on, so while patterning and building I pretty much amalgamated those aspects into something I felt represented the overall design. To judge how big the prop should be, I find a full body image of Zagreus holding the blade and roughly mark out how long the sword is compared to his body. By doing this, I can see that the sword goes from Zagreus' head to his knees. I then see what that measurement is on my body, so it'll be in proportion to my height. So my Stygian blade is going to be about 44 inches long. To start drawing the pattern, I stick 3 pieces of A3 paper together using masking tape. I then mark the measurements I just took on the paper to denote the full length of the sword. I mark and draw a centre line. I now begin to measure out and sketch the pattern for the blade. I use a PVC pipe to mark out the grip, as this is the material I'll use to make the base for the grip later on. I roughly mark a circle for the handguard and then use a compass to draw it on properly. I then begin to draw the skull and the laurel surrounding it onto one side of the centre line. Though I sketch out the other side, I'm only concerned with getting one side of this pattern fully rendered, as I will fold the pattern along the centre line to cut it out symmetrically. While I'm drawing the pattern, especially the skull on the handguard and some details on the pommel, I like to make some notes about what I think I might make different parts from. Though I may deviate from some of these notes later on, it's useful to think ahead to how I'm going to make different parts of the build. For example, I know I'm going to need to cast the gems in the skull's eyes, that the laurel will require layered leaves made from foam that's thinner than the blade, and that I will sculpt the skull on the handguard from foam clay because of its organic shape. When I'm done with the handguard and grip, I pattern one side of the blade. This includes where the blade will become beveled, the slanted layered pattern running up the blade, and the symbols etched into the blade tip, although I render these in more detail later on. While I'm drawing the pattern, I also create the pieces that will form the rigid core of the blade. The grip will be built around a PVC pipe core, as I mentioned earlier. I mark how long it needs to be and cut it down with a handsaw. I also loosely draw where any attachments are going to go so that I can ensure there's enough room for them. For this build, the only attachment is a PVC connector attaching the handguard to the grip. This is so that I can make the rest of the hilt detachable, which will allow me to break down the sword for easier transportation and storage. The blade itself will have a wooden dowel sandwiched inside it. I mark the length of the dowel, leaving enough so that it can be glued into the PVC connector and feed into the handguard for continuous stability. I cut the dowel down with my handsaw and make sure everything lines up on the pattern. Then I cut out a small circle of thick 10mm foam to fit into the connector. I cut a hole in the centre of it big enough for the dowel to fit through. I glue the circle of foam into one side of the PVC connector with superglue. I then feed the dowel through to halfway into the connector and glue it in place. Now I have the core of my blade and my finished pattern. I fold the pattern in half down the centre line and carefully cut it out. For now, I cut the laurel part of the handguard pattern off, but keep it so that I can reattach it later if I need it. I unfold the cutout pattern. I have a symmetrical sword pattern to work off of. Now I'm ready to transfer the pattern to foam. I cut off the grip part of the pattern as I'm going to cut out the blade and the base of the handguard as one piece. I'm starting by making the blade first using 10mm foam. The Stygian Blade has a lot of bulk to its design, so I want to use thicker foam for this prop. I tack my pattern to the foam with sewing needles. Then I trace the pattern directly onto the foam in Sharpie. I need 2 pieces for the blade. I also place the pipe connector on both pieces and trace where it's going to sit so that I can cut out a space for it. Using a Stanley knife and a scalpel, I carefully cut out the 2 blade pieces. Now that I have my 2 blade pieces, I cut out and trace on the bevel line I marked on the pattern. Beveling is cutting at a 45-degree angle rather than straight. When doing this, your blade needs to be very sharp, so either change or sharpen your blade before doing this and frequently throughout. I very carefully bevel the edges of both sword pieces on one side. When the 2 blade pieces are stuck together, this is going to create the sloping, sharp edge of the sword. I flip the foam blade pieces upside down to the side that is not beveled and use the wooden dowel core to mark where I'm going to cut a trench down the centre of the blade on both pieces. I cut this trench at a beveled angle, not cutting all the way through the foam but instead creating a long piece running down the whole blade I can remove. When I glue the 2 pieces of the blade together, the wooden dowel will be glued in between them and this trench is where it will sit. To glue foam, I use contact adhesive. Contact adhesive gives off toxic fumes, so always wear a respirator when you're using it. I apply contact adhesive to the trench in one piece of the blade and on one side of the wooden dowel. When the glue has set, I lay the wooden dowel into the trench and glue it in place. I then cut the other trench and apply contact adhesive to both inner sides of the blade and the dowel. When the contact adhesive has dried to the point it's a little tacky, this usually takes about 5 minutes, I carefully begin to stick both sides of the blade together. I try to match the outer edges of the blade as much as possible. Once the 2 sides of the blade are stuck together, I use my Dremel with a sanding drum bit attached and sand down the edges to neaten them. I do a couple of passes, sealing the foam with my heat gun in between them so that I can better see what work needs to be done. I then switch to a stone grinding bit to smooth out the foam more. After this, I do one more pass with the heat gun. Like when using contact adhesive, I always wear a respirator when I'm sanding foam. Sanding kicks up a lot of foam dust and you really don't want to breathe that stuff in. At this point, I like to add a little super glue to the tip of the blade. This will help it retain its shape and sharpness. I also use polyfiller to fill in any areas where there are gaps and where I can still see the sewing pin marks from earlier. Now that the base of the blade shape is done, I add details on top, starting with the layered shape near the handguard. I cut out the shape from the pattern and mark where it will be placed on the blade. I then transfer the pattern to thin 2mm foam, trace it twice and cut them out with a scalpel. I then cut the pattern down to the next layer and repeat the process with this piece. I work my way down each layer of the pattern, transferring each of them to foam and numbering them as I go. I cut each foam piece out and mark where each layer will sit when they're placed over each other. I then cut out the piece of the pattern that was removed from the handguard section and tape it back onto the pattern. I use this to mark where the handguard will meet the layered foam piece. I then sand the edges of each foam piece down with the Dremel, and I heat seal each piece. I then flip the foam pieces to the other side and fold them in half to create a crease. I use the crease to mark a centre line on each piece. I carefully cut a very thin trench into the back of each foam piece. I fill the trench with hot glue and fold down the sides of the foam piece. This creates a ridge in the foam. With contact adhesive, I glue the layers of foam onto each other one by one, until I have 2 layered stacks of foam. I then sand down the edges of the foam stacks. Before I glue the layered pieces in place, I want to create the next layer of the handguard so that they'll fit together. I trace around the handguard onto 5mm foam and cut it out. I place this new traced piece onto the handguard and mark where it meets the layered piece I just created. I then carve down and sand the end of the layered piece so that it flows into the handguard better. Now they fit together nicely. I trim and sand down the edges of the new handguard pieces. These are going to have the laurels and the skull put over them, but I still want to round the edges off so the surface is even. When all the pieces are sanded, I glue both the layered foam pieces and the handguard pieces to the blade with contact adhesive. I then do some more sanding to even out the seams, and also use polyfiller to get an even coating on all the edges. I know that a lot of these edges will end up being covered, but for the areas that are visible, this will help to hide the seam lines. Now that the base design for the blade and the handguard sections are done, I start to work on the grip and the pommel. First, I'm going to use 2mm foam to wrap the PVC pipe to bulk it out. I make sure to leave a piece of the PVC pipe exposed where it needs to go into the connector, otherwise it won't fit anymore. I mark and cut how much foam I need to wrap the pipe. Then I use contact adhesive to glue the foam to the pipe. I only apply glue to half of the foam and the pipe at first, stick the first half in place, and then glue and finish the second half. When I join the seam lines, I try to press them together as neatly as possible to reduce how visible the seam is. Usually for sword grips, I wrap them in one layer of 2mm foam, but considering the size of the rest of the sword, this time I wrapped the grip twice. I simply repeated the same process to create another layer of foam. I then sand down the seam line on the grip. I cut out a small circle of foam and glue it into the hole at the pommel end of the pipe to cover it up. And now I have the base of the grip done. Using my pattern, I mark out where extra details like ridges of foam are going to be added to the grip. There are also some lines carved into the grip which I sketch on in Sharpie. I then carve these lines out with my scalpel. To create the raised ridges, I use the same method as before of wrapping the grip in a piece of foam the width I want, marking its length, cutting it down to size, and gluing it around the grip. I also sand down the edges to round them off. For the much more rounded ridge near the pommel, I use a foam half dowel. I cut it down to size, apply contact adhesive, and wrap it around the pommel. Next, I carve the symbols into the blade. To do this, I first finalise them on the pattern, as I only sketched them before. I fold the pattern in half and draw half of each symbol. Then, after I cut them out, I'll have a symmetrical stencil for them. I place the stencil onto the blade and draw the symbols on in Sharpie. I then flip the blade over and repeat. Using a sharp scalpel blade, I carefully carve the symbols at a 45-degree beveled angle so that they look like they've been carved into the sword. I then use my heat gun to seal the foam and clean them up. Next, I make the laurels around the handguard and the skull. Though I drew a pattern for the laurels initially, I decided to draw a new one at this stage as I also wanted to slightly change the shape of the skull. I cut out the final skull shape and use it, as well as an outline of the blade I've made so far, to sketch the new laurel design. I want the laurels to sit underneath where the skull will be sculpted so they look like they're growing out from it. I'm going to cut out the back pieces of the laurels as one piece, and the laurels layered on top as individual leaves. I begin with making the back pieces. I was initially going to make these from 2mm foam, but decided on 5mm instead so that they'd be more robust, but still thinner than the rest of the sword. I cut out 4 pieces total, 2 for each side of the handguard. I bevel one side of each of the laurel bases. This is so I can glue them together to create a more 3-dimensional shape. I also bevel and sand down the edge that will sit underneath the skull. I apply contact adhesive to the beveled edges of the laurel leaves and stick them together. I tack the first laurel to the handguard to see how it looks. Now I'm happy that it's going to look the way I want it to. So I cut out and make the second laurel base. I pin both laurels to the handguard and mark where I'm going to glue them. I apply contact adhesive to the laurels and the handguard and glue them down. I sand down the base laurels before I make the next layer. There are some small gaps in the laurels, so I use foam clay to cover them. To give myself an even working surface for the next layer, I also apply foam clay around the inner edges of the laurels. At this point, my dog decided that he really needed some attention, so I gave him some cuddles while I drew each individual laurel leaf for the second layer onto 5mm foam. With the dog safely out of the way, I cut out the individual laurel leaves. I then round off the edges of each leaf, and then sand them down nice and smooth with the Dremel. I draw a line on the back of each leaf and cut a trench like I did in the 2mm foam pieces before. Again, gluing and curving in this trench creates a ridge in the foam. In this case, it creates the impression of each leaf having a midrib, while still retaining the stylized aesthetic of Hades. I pin the leaves to the sword and mark where I'll need to glue them. Some of the pieces need to overlap, so I carve down one side and sand it so the overlaid leaf will fit better. I apply contact adhesive and glue down each of the laurel leaves. One side done. Now I just need to glue down the leaves on the other side. I pin the skull pattern onto the sword to see how it looks. Next, I'm making the pointed gemstone on the pommel of the sword. I started by tracing a circle from the pommel onto 5mm foam and cutting it out. I round off the edges of the disc of foam and then sand them down to make a flat base for the gemstone. I cut out some triangles of foam and bevel all the edges on one side. I apply contact adhesive to the beveled edges. I then stick each piece together to create a foam pyramid, which I then glue onto the disc. I wanted to create a more rounded off edge for the gemstone, so I sculpt over it with foam clay. When the finished sculpt is dry, I use my Dremel to sand it down. When I'm done, I coat the gemstone in a layer of Mod Podge so it won't get damaged while I continue to work on the rest of the sword, and glue it to the pommel with contact adhesive. And with that, the build for the grip and pommel is done. Next, I start working on the skull of the handguard of the sword. To make this, I'm going to use the tinfoil armature and foam clay sculpting method that I also used in my Doomicorn video. I begin by tearing up pieces of foil, scrunching them up, and hot gluing them straight onto the handguard. At first, I just want to create a level area to continue building on top of. When I have the handguard level, I cut out my pattern and use it to trace on where the mouth will be. This area is going to be recessed, so I cut out some foam about the right shape and glue it down. Then trace where the mouth will be again. I then repeat this process for the eyes and nose so I know where all of these recessed areas will be, and I can leave them clear of any further sculpting. I then continue building up foil onto the skull shape, leaving the marked areas clear. I gradually build these layers of foil to create a foil armature to sculpt on top of. Sculpting with foil like this allows me to bulk up an armature quickly with a cheap material, starting with a basic shape and then adding details such as the teeth. I then continue building on top of this with larger pieces of foil to make the skull three-dimensional and begin to define areas in anatomical detail such as the cheeks, brow ridges, and jaw. I take some time to step away from the sculpt and return to it later so that I can see what work needs to be done more clearly. I decided I wanted the shape to be more bulked out at the forehead and brow ridges, so I kept working. I also wanted to work on the teeth some more to make them more defined. Now that I was happy with the skull's face, I started working on the other side. As seen in this art of Zagreus holding the blade sideways, the other side of the sword is just the back of the skull, so this doesn't require quite as much sculpting as the front. Like with the front, I start by evenly bulking out the area the skull will be with foil and defining its shape. I then begin building up thicker layers of foil to bulk it out into the right size. The top of the head will be thicker with it sloping down to a thinner shape at the bottom. I ended up working on the front of the skull a little more, deciding that it still needed more bulk to it and a different shape around the nose and cheeks to better match the references. Now that I'm happy with the foil armature, I move on to the next step, which is sculpting on top of the armature with foam clay. To start applying foam clay to the armature, I dampen an area with water so that the foam clay will stick to it. I start with the back of the skull and cover the entire piece with a layer of foam clay. For the very edges where it's difficult to reach, I sometimes use sculpting tools to get an even finish. When the back of the skull is completely covered, I smooth it down as much as possible. I wait for the back of the skull to dry completely before I begin working on the front. The great thing about foam clay is that it can be sanded just like regular foam when it's dry, but I still want to give myself as even a working surface as possible before then. Again, I apply water to the armature and sculpt on top of it. The front will require more work and attention than the back, but for now I focus on covering the entire armature evenly. For the teeth, I have to apply smaller pieces of foam clay and use the sculpting tools to reach and shape the gaps between them. I also use the same tools to shape the nose. With the entire face covered, I begin adding more bulk and definition to some areas, particularly around the cheeks and teeth. There's still more sculpting work I want to do, but I wait for the sculpt so far to dry first. Foam clay isn't as dense as regular clay, so sometimes I prefer to wait for layers to dry before I continue sculpting on top of them. In particular, this lets me be much more precise when continuing to sculpt smaller areas like the teeth. I add some small spikes of foam to the bottom row of teeth to bulk them out, then shape and blend them with the sculpting tools. I then add foam clay to the rest of the chin to shape it and blend it in with the teeth. Then I repeat this process for the top row of teeth as well. Next, I keep working on the area around the nose. Looking at my reference images, it needs to be more rounded off than I've made it, so I add more foam clay. I then add foam clay into the gap between the teeth and smooth it down. I also do the same for the eye sockets, and then I leave the entire sculpt to dry. When the sculpt is dry, I sand it down with my Dremel. This will help me to get a smooth, even finish, as I've been working in multiple layers of foam which can create some small lines in the foam. I switch to a small stone grinding bit to reach some smaller areas like between the teeth. I then use the large stone grinding bit to smooth out the sanded foam. I apply some filler to any areas that need it. While I wait for the filler to dry, I make the gemstones for the eyes. I already have a soft mold that will work perfectly for this. To cast the gemstones, I'm going to use Cosplay Flex, which is a friendly plastic. I put down a heat-proof mat, pour some of the plastic beads into an old roll of tape to stop them from rolling around, and use my heat gun to melt them down. When the beads are melted, I can push the Cosplay Flex into the mold. Cosplay Flex only takes about 20 minutes to set, and this kind cools to a crystal-like texture. When it's cooled, I remove it from the mold, and then I trim down the edges. I then repeat this process again to make the second gemstone. To paint the gemstones, I use nail polish. I start with a layer of matte dark green for a base. When that's dry, I go over it with a shimmery light green. This creates a layered crystalline look to the gems that will differentiate them from the rest of the paint job, which will be done in acrylic paint. Back to the blade itself, it's time to prime it for painting. With the filler set, I use black hex flex for the first layer of primer to make the entire sword one unified base colour. First, I do the front of the blade, and while that's drying, I coat the grip. Then I coat the back of the blade. For the other layers of primer, I'm going to use Mod Podge. Mod Podge is great for static props like this. It'll create a hard coating over the foam clay and make it take paint very well. I apply it evenly to the blade with a large flat brush. To get into the carved symbols, I use a smaller pointed brush as well. When the front is dry, I flip it over and cover the back. It takes a few layers of Mod Podge on each side for it to be fully primed. I do about 4 layers on each side. On the last couple layers, I switch to using a mop brush for a smooth coating. And of course, I also do the same to the grip. Now the Stygian Blade is primed and ready to be painted. To prepare the blade for painting, I mask off some areas with frog tape, a painter's masking tape. I'm going to start by painting all the red areas first, so I mark off all the areas around the inner blade and the laurels. For the red sections, I use a cadmium-free deep red paint. I use a curved flathead brush to lay down the majority of the paint, and then use a pointed brush to fill in the carved symbols. I then do the same for the laurels. When the red paint is dry, I apply a layer of spray varnish to seal it and protect it before removing the masking tape. Through the entire painting process, I'll be spraying on a layer of varnish in between each step. Sealing each layer as I go means I can continue to use frog tape without tearing up the paint I've already applied. I remove the masking tape from the front of the blade and apply it to the back of the blade. I then paint the back of the blade. I want to add some more dimension to the laurels, so I stipple on a layer of medium red to the tips of the leaves and blend it into the deep red. When the paint is dry, I remove the rest of the frog tape. Next, I mask off around the skull with more frog tape. For the base layer on the skull, I mix titanium white and raw sienna. When the paint was dry, I decided it was slightly too warm of a tone, so I mixed some neutral grey into my white and sienna mixture to cool the tone down a bit. This looks much better. When the front is dry, I remove the frog tape. I then apply tape to the back and paint that as well. Next, I start painting the grip. First, I mask off some areas. I paint the red strip first. For the bluish colour on the main part of the grip, I mix metallic blue, Payne's grey, and bright silver. Next, I mask off the gold areas. To paint them, I start with a layer of rich bronze. Then, when that's dry, I dry brush on a layer of rich gold. Finally, I mask off the area around the gemstone on the pommel. Just like with the eye gems, I paint it with nail varnish. First a layer of dark green, and then the shimmery lighter green. I seal the nail varnish with a clear top coat. With the grip done, I go back to the blade. I mask off the area around the layered pieces of foam. These layers are coloured in a gradient, so each one will be a different tone. I'm using combinations of neutral grey, bright silver, and Payne's grey. For the first and lightest layer, I mix only the grey and silver together. While I wait for the lightest layer to dry, I paint the darkest layer in Payne's grey only. Then I mask off so I can paint the second colour. I continue painting, sealing, and masking off the layers as I go, working from lightest to darkest. When it's all set, I remove the frog tape. Finally, I need to paint the edges of the blade, so I mask this area off. For the blade edge, I'm mixing titanium white and iridescent white so it has a shimmer to it. I paint on 2 layers of the white mixture. I then paint on another layer of just the iridescent white on its own. I remove the frog tape, and then do a few touch-ups by hand. Now that the base colours are finished, I do one more layer of spray varnish over the whole sword. Here's the Stygian Blade so far with the base colours down. I love how vibrant this paint job looks right now, but it's a little too clean. I need to weather it next and add some finishing touches. I checked my references again and noticed a brown patch on the grip, so I mixed buff titanium and burnt umber to paint it. Then, to start weathering the skull, I paint on a layer of buff titanium. I use kitchen towel to scrub most of it away, but leave behind a mottled layer over the white to create a bone-like colour. I paint an extra layer of the buff titanium into the areas that are the most dark and recessed in the eyes, nose, and mouth. Next, I start a black wash over the entire sword. I paint the entire piece with watery black paint, making sure to get into all the recesses. I then use kitchen towel to wipe most of the paint away, leaving behind a subtle weathering job. For the blade, I start off only painting black into the symbols and the very edges of the layered pieces. I then use kitchen towel and cotton buds to blend it in. I then add black and blend it into the eye sockets, nose, and mouth of the skull. I also add some additional shading to recessed areas. Next, I shade the laurels with a black wash. This creates some nice definition between the leaves. Then I spray varnish the sword. Now I do a further, more watered down black wash over the whole blade. That's one side down and one more to go. I repeat the black wash process on the back of the sword. The next stage of weathering is highlighting. I mainly do this by dry brushing a lighter tone over the edges of each different coloured area. I brush raw sienna over the brown patch on the grip. For the rest of the grip, I mix metallic blue and bright silver. When dry brushing, I apply only a little paint to a rough bristled brush, and wipe most of the paint off the brush before lightly dusting it over the edges of the piece. This creates natural highlights. For the gemstones, I mix emerald green and medium yellow. I dry brush over the dark and silver layered pieces with silver. I use medium red to dry brush over the tips of the laurel leaves. I then do the same for the red part of the blade, lightly dusting some lighter red over it. I also add a little silver dry brushing to some of the edges of the blade. For the skull, I mix buff titanium and titanium white. For a last touch to the skull, I do another wash in raw umber to further lowlight a few recessed areas and create more of a gradual transition from the lightest to darkest tones. I wanted to add a bit more brightness to the laurels, so I mixed medium yellow and red for an orangey tone and dry brush it onto the tips of the leaves. Now I finely glue the gemstones in place in the eye sockets using hot glue. I spray one last layer of satin spray varnish over the entire sword and leave it to set. And with that, my Stygian Blade is complete. I loved working on this build so much, combining a few different skills like foam crafting, sculpting, and casting, as well as getting to paint that vibrant colour scheme. I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial just as much as I enjoyed working on this build. If you did, please leave a like and a comment down below, and if you'd like to see more cosplay and crafting tutorials and video content, please subscribe to my channel and hit that bell so you get notified when I upload. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.